If you're attending this week's Hart Energy DUL East conference here in Pittsburgh, then you probably know that DUG stands for Developing Unconventional Gas. And you might also know that over the last 15 years since the first DUG conference, Hart Energy has made the understandable decision to start to de-emphasize the G in DUG because of unconventional oil. And so taking a page from Hart Energy, today we too are going to de-emphasize the gas, and not just because natural gas prices are down about 10% here, mere hours before the kickoff of DUG, but we're going to do it because we want to focus on something that goes beyond a lot of the technical and the business conversations that will be had this week at DUG, and focus on you as a leader. And we want to focus on the ways that you as a leader want to be seen as unconventional. And not just going through the motions and not just doing all of the things that every other leader or every other leadership development program or training or LinkedIn post or book or blog or podcast or webinar or seminar, all of those things are great, but are you just doing all of the things that those things are telling you to do to become a leader? Or are you differentiated? Are you unconventional? And so today we're going to, again, play off of this week's Hart Energy conference, and we're going to talk about developing unconventional leaders. And again, this applies regardless of whether you are one of the leaders on stage representing his or her company and speaking to the masses about everything that's going on in the industry or their individual organization. This will apply to you whether you are in a career hunt and you're looking to find a new leadership position. And this, quite frankly, applies even if you're an individual contributor or any sort of supervisor or manager. Although I will say that we decided not to go with developing unconventional managers today, of course, because the DUM conference probably would not play so well. But we are comfortable going with DUL conference because it's more of a subtle way to help remind you, again, if you're sitting at the conference this week, that you don't want to be seen as a DUL leader. You don't want to be seen as a conventional leader. You want to be seen as somebody who brings something that's different, that's unconventional, and that can in turn generate unconventional, long-term, sustainable results relative to other people that are trying to do the same thing. And to help you do that today, we're going to step through the same 5-step leadership development program that I use in all of my coaching that mirrors the energy life cycle. And we're going to step through a number of questions that you can ask as you go through your own exploration phase and development phase and production phase and transportation phase and finally the distribution phase. And the first of those phases, the exploration phase, is of course where you need to get clarity about what it is you're looking for. I mean, that by definition is what it means to explore, to go out and to look for something. And in some cases, you might have specific idea of what you're looking for. In some cases, it might be more vague, but you do need to define it, whatever the case might be. Because what I see with individual leaders, and certainly with companies as a whole, is that they struggle defining this identity and in turn find themselves going through identity crises. And this becomes really clear for companies that are going through mergers and acquisitions, of course, but it's also clear for any company and any leader that's responding to exterior pressures regarding ESG and the need from the public to show that you're trying to do things from a sustainability standpoint that mirror all of the demands of various investors and outsiders and public opinion, whatever the case might be. As leaders are responding to all of those external things, it's chipping away at their identity. What is necessary is to get crystal clear about your identity so you don't sound like everybody else. Because again, if you've read through a standard corporate social responsibility report or a ESG report, whatever the case might be, you know full well that many of them start to sound the same. And if internally your employees and quite frankly, any of your stakeholders see that you're starting to sound the same and you don't have some crystal clear vision of what your identity is as a company and in turn, what your identity is as a leader, then you're asking for trouble. And you're asking for, quite frankly, others to begin questioning whether or not you, your team, your organization are really meant to be in the position that you're in. And all that being said, you can develop a clear identity, but then the next step, of course, is to develop a clear strategy to execute upon that identity. And that brings us to the next phase, which is the development phase. And in this phase, you're coming up with what? A plan. How are you going to take this identity, take your mission, your vision, whatever the case might be, and execute upon it? And again, this is an area where, unfortunately, many leaders fall into a trap of taking the conventional approach. They're doing the same thing that everybody else is seen as doing. And certainly in our industry for years, that approach could be summed up by, growth, growth for growth's sake, whatever it took, as long as you could do it safely, you want to keep growing. Clearly that has been tossed out the window. And now everybody is focused on a strategy that's based on, capital discipline and generating free cash flow. And of course, checking all the boxes on from an ESG standpoint. But the question is for you as a leader, or certainly as a company as a whole, is whether or not that strategy is really any different from anybody else. And if it's not, why? Because in some cases, doing what everybody else is doing is fine as a strategy. But what's not fine is if you're not aware of it. If you're trying to mirror what everybody else is doing and you think that that's the best path to, sustainable returns and sustainable results, then hey, good for you. But if you're not asking the question, well, then how could you possibly know whether or not you're falling into the trap of so many leaders of just going through the motions? And this doesn't just apply from a corporate standpoint, but also from a career standpoint. And again, these are conversations that I have regularly with folks, including last night. Somebody who was asking the question, well, I don't know what's out there. Joe, do you know what opportunities are out there? What's available? What are people looking for? And again, I had to stop and say, well, two things. One, going back to here, what do you want? What is your identity? What's going to fuel you and feed your fire, if you will? If you can't be clear about that, then don't worry about trying to match up your skill set with somebody else. And now if you are clear about that and there's jobs out there, now that brings you to the strategy phase here. And again, if you're just going through the same motions of updating your resume and putting stuff on LinkedIn, the same approaches that, again, you can read and hear from thousands of sources out there, then, well, what do you expect? If you're just going through and you're doing the same conventional things that everybody else is doing, well, again, you should expect conventional results, which is, in many cases, unfortunately, a long, painful time in transition. So ask yourself whether you're on the career side, whether you're in a leadership role, whether or not you're taking a differentiated approach to your strategy, or whether you're going through the same motions and you're doing the same things that every other company is doing and, quite frankly, might be talking about this week at DUL East. The next phase in all of this is the production phase, because what good is it if you have an identity and a mission and a strategy and you execute upon that strategy? What good is it if you don't generate results? So in this phase, we lean on something that I say quite often, publicly on the energy detox, or certainly privately in conversations that I have with folks. And that is that the production results, the things that you've generated, don't necessarily speak for themselves. They can be misleading. And so you need to ask yourself, in what ways are you misleading yourself, misleading your stakeholders, not from a fraud standpoint, but how are the results that you're putting out there and that you're generating, perhaps, steering people away from what your true focus is? And again, we can come back to ESG reports and sustainability reports and, quite frankly, quarterly earnings calls where companies tout the same darn things over and over again, and they all sound fluffy, they all sound good, but the reality is, in many cases, they're all adjusted, right? They're all some non-GAAP measure. They're all adjusted numbers to make your free cash flow, not to keep beating on free cash flow, but to make it look better than it really is. And so too, from an environmental standpoint, you can spin all this stuff till your heart's content to make it sound good. But do the results really tell a picture of what's going on? Do they really point to what needs to be done? And again, if you're looking to, perhaps fool investors, again, in a non-fraudulent way, then that's one thing. But if you're fooling yourself, if you're fooling your employees, or at least you're trying to, well, that's not sustainable at all. Because I guarantee you have employees who are on LinkedIn scrolling through, and they might come across your company's posts, and they sound an awful lot like everybody else. All the results start to blend together. And again, you've seen this, right? You've seen companies that are injecting numbers and percentages and all kinds of stuff, and it all sounds the same. Whether it's a, 20% reduction in carbon footprint, or 15%, or 25%. And again, it starts to all just blend together. And if that's what's happening for you from a results standpoint, then ask yourself if those are even the right metrics to be looking at if your audience is going to start losing interest. And this is all related to the next phase, which of course is the transportation phase. Because if you generate results and can't get them into the hands or the eyes and the ears of the people that need to hear them, then what good are they? So in this transportation phase, again, we look for opportunities to flow better, to get your message flowing and moving in the right direction in a more consistent manner. And more importantly, to avoid areas of corrosion. Because again, you might have the best results in the world. You might have the cleanest vision in the world. You might have the best strategy and the best executed strategy. But if you can't communicate all of that to your stakeholders, then what good is it? And in many cases, the communication fails because of corrosion that you're not aware of as a leader. again, if there's one thing, if there's one takeaway, if there's one question from all of this, it's for you to ask yourself, in what ways are you communicating in a way that is corrosive? Whether that's with customers, whether that's with investors, whether you are, again, on the job hunt and you're trying to communicate with prospective employees or employers rather, whatever the case might be, you need to ask yourself, how is your message perhaps turning people away? And again, I want to be clear, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're aware of it. If you're conscious of the ways in which your words can be pushing people away, then all right, that's something you can live with. But if you're unaware of that, and if you're unaware of again, how your words can perhaps get people, more fired up than they need to be, then you're asking for trouble. But if you're conscious of it, if you're aware that, yeah, I'm going to say this and it's really going to get under, so-and-so's skin and it's by design, well, yeah, fine, go for it. But again, when it comes to conscious leadership, the way in which you communicate is by and large the biggest risk for you as a leader. And on the flip side, are your messages getting lost? Are they getting bottlenecked? Are they getting stopped at different pinch points in the system because you're trying to throw so much in there? And again, this can come into play when it comes to ESG and all this environmental stuff. Is all the good message that you want to tell about yourself, about your company, about your organization, is it getting lost and getting buried and basically plugged up from all this other stuff? So again, ask that question. I don't have an answer for you. Certainly, you can look at your own communication strategies, internal and external, and ask yourself, is there corrosion? Are there bottlenecks? And if so, how can you address them? And then the final piece in all of this is the distribution phase, the downstream phase. And of course, this is where we recall, again, as I say often, that we are in a commodity business and you do not want to be known as a commodity when it comes to leadership, because there are plenty of current and aspiring leaders. And quite frankly, if your stakeholders start to look at you and see you as somebody who's, again, just going through the motions and doing things in a very conventional way, then they're going to start to lose confidence in you. And even if you're in that position and continue to be in that position, as you lose the confidence of your stakeholders, whether they're customers or employees or investors, again, you're going to see those results and you're going to see it, kind of trickle through this whole life cycle, if you will. So ask yourself, are you allowing yourself to be seen as a commodity? Are you allowing yourself to be seen as somebody who isn't necessarily doing things in a different manner? And again, there's a flip side to that, right? If you're seen as somebody who's only doing things just to be different and not doing it in a very thoughtful manner, that's obviously not a good thing either. We're not advocating for that, but you need to at least ask yourself the question, are you really an unconventional leader who is expected to generate unconventional results? Or are you going through the motions? Are you a generic leader? Are you a conventional leader? Are you a boring leader? Are you a dull leader here to play off the acronym that we're stealing from Hart Energy this week? So ask yourself that question. And if you have any doubts, then the first way to start to kind of build some momentum and make sure that you're not a conventional leader is to make sure that you have a full understanding of this entire picture here and how everything is connected. And again, this seems almost juvenile for leaders that have been in position, in some cases, for decades. But the reality is many leaders do get overly focused on one of these elements. Maybe it's just a communication piece and they're just trying to get a message out there without realizing that the actual message here that, is in the results phase is junk. Or conversely, they're going through all of this without remembering that they should have some clear vision. And the more they focus on this, that vision can get lost. And again, that's not to say that you can't do all of these things, of course. And that's not to say there aren't trade-offs. And sometimes a focus on A necessarily means a lack of a focus on B. And that's okay. But what differentiates leaders and what ensures that you as a leader will not be commoditized is your ability to understand this full picture, to ask the right questions, to lean on the right resources that are out there, again, on guard for situations where there's some chinks in the armor, if you will, when it comes to each of these 5 steps. And if you can do those things, then you are more likely to be a successful, sustainable, confident, and unconventional leader.